We had a community that was just recovering from having been condemned. Lots of people wouldn't invest. People wouldn't invest in it. Now, simultaneous with that, or almost simultaneous with that, there was another great change that has been overlooked. And that was the transference of virtually all seagoing shipping from Fells Point to the Dundalk Marine Terminals and to the Maryland Port Authority. So that we had, well, the effect of one of the old Western boom towns. The gold rush was over. The seamen no longer came. With the result that from a period, let's say, 1965 to maybe 1975, Fells Point was a community in very dangerous flux.
The city had taken over so much of it that a lot of it was worse than before the city took it over, because they would, for instance, turn off the heat. Everything would be ruined. Roofs would be leaking, and it needed, like, a lot of the place needed more work than they did even before the city took it over. But you see, that was 11 years of vacant houses, and that was really bad.
But then something very good happened. The city set up excellent standards for rehabilitation of historic property within these taking lines, and first allowing the families that had originally owned the properties to come back and purchase them. They put them up for sale to the public at a very reasonable price, with the condition that you had to restore them to the standards that they had selected.
I did a book for the city. Each person who bought a house got this booklet, and they got a page with their house on it. And on that page, it shows exactly what has to be done on the front of that house.
There was a tremendous collision of cultures in Fells Point. Well-to-do people coming in from the suburbs, professional people, well-educated people, were buying homes in Fells Point, and we're fixing them up. They met resentment from a lot of the older people who had been there, because, you know, they saw a threat to their being able to stay there due to rising property taxes. For the folks that had come in themselves, the poorer folks, the artisans, the sailors, and so forth, they saw the collision because their way of life was much looser. And they weren't particularly concerned about historic homeowner tax credits. They didn't worry about where to park their car. They only had one car. And they could park it on a back street. They didn't care. Many of the families coming in owned 2 and 3 cars, and their houses were only 17 feet wide. So they insisted they had to have a place to park.
It was a lot of divisiveness. The battles at those town meetings were just notorious, and there was old residents against new residents. The old residents didn't really understand. They thought they were being kicked out of the community. And the newer residents didn't do anything to assure them that they weren't being kicked out. And then you had some people who came in for their own political advantages who festered on that.
I moved in '67 to Fells Point, and they saw me as a freeloader coming in, buying cheap property. Everybody else who came in, when I came in, we got a bad reputation because we were fighting the road as well. Anybody who moved into the neighborhood from outside, they ostracized and they said that they were rich because they're coming in fixing up these houses. And when you walked around the neighborhood, they sneered at you. As a matter of fact, Laura Norris, one of the priests at the church, stopped her on the street and told her that he thought that she was one of Hitler's people working in this neighborhood against these poor Poles. And Laura was horrified. I mean, she had never even spoken to this priest before. But that was typical of what was going on.
I moved here in Fells Point in 1968. I just graduated from the Maryland Institute and moved down here with about 8 other graduate students, artists, sculptors, and painters. And we did it because the rents were so incredibly cheap down here. And I just fell in love with it. Most people in the city and in suburbia wouldn't even come down here. They thought it was too dangerous. In its history, it was a dangerous place. People were shanghaied from here in the 1800s or 1900s, but we were young artists and this was very intriguing to us. And we became kind of party central. People from all over the city and the country would stop in to our little commune. And that's how I met John Waters. And he came one day with Devine and Mink Stowe and David Lockery and Susan Lowe and his whole group that had just finished doing a movie, Mondo Trasho. And we became instant friends. And so the next time he was working on a film, he had all of us become part of his troupe, the Dreamland community.
There was a real pioneering spirit in those days in Fells Point because most of us didn't have anything. And so we started out with nothing and we had to kind of pull together to get there. Artists and musicians and merchant seamen and longshoremen and immigrants and folks that didn't speak English and folks that didn't bother to check in with government authorities when they got off the boat. It was a time of some innocence. Unfortunately, a lot of those people that I knew then died young. They spent a lot of their lives in the saloons, in the bars, and drugs became a factor. People that didn't have families anymore, didn't have any money, couldn't hold a job, and who died tragic deaths, early deaths.
So there were still what I would call active vestiges of Baltimore's maritime and industrial past cooking in the 70s. And industry was still here, though on its way out. Brown's Wharf, the Ruckerts were still operating there in a lesser way. Miller's Wharf was still standing and still being used. The Bond Street Wharf, which was Terminal Corporation, was still standing and being used. Allied Chemical was going strong and puffing out whatever they were puffing out.
Just before I came to Baltimore, the Baltimore soap plant had a significant environmental release that gained national press coverage. In August of 1978, there was a leak that developed on the sulfur trioxide storage tank. And by 7 o'clock in the evening, there was a sulfuric acid cloud that extended from Baltimore northward to York, Pennsylvania. Of course, it went directly over Fells Point. There were a number of folks that went to hospital and reported breathing problems, skin burning issue problems.
A lot of the people here in the 20th century, they were later immigrants, the Polish community, but this was their livelihood. We didn't know what caused cancer and the whole thing. And later on we found out that we had so many cancer deaths in Fells Point. It was way out of proportion to the national average.
Our impact on the land and the air, our impact on the people in an urban setting, led the company to, I think, ultimately decide that we were better moving our manufacturing operations out of urban areas and out of the Baltimore area in particular. The Baltimore plant was considered to have the second largest risk of any manufacturing site we had in the world. And reducing that risk became a priority for the company.
When I first got here, there were buildings and properties all the way down to the Inner Harbor. And slowly but surely, developers would buy these old factories and old lumber companies and stuff like that. And then usually one Sunday a year, one of the buildings would burn to the ground until eventually all the acreage was cleared. My theory is just that it's the easiest way to get out of having to renovate something is to have a fire.
One evening, I think I was over in some other part of town and looked over and saw the flames, and like everybody else, we came rushing back to the area to see what's going on. And this wonderful lumber company, the Atlantic Lumber, went up in flames. A lot of great wood, seasoned, wonderful, the kind of wood that you just can't find in lumber yards anymore. And then right near it was the Apex little oil company. Well, as the drums got heated up, became explosive, they just went up in the air, like shot up like mortars.
Allied Chemical closed shop in the late 80s, and by then most of everything else out on the Harper Point Peninsula was gone. Constellation had bought the terminal warehouse, and Barry Levinson had done his movie and had his fake fire for Avalon in the terminal warehouse building, and so that by the early 90s the industrial past was truly a past.